So thanks so much for having me, everybody. I appreciate everyone taking some time out of your day to learn a little bit more about PIPA and what we're talking about when it comes to privacy. And that's where I wanted to start this presentation with what is privacy? What does this mean, this word that we're talking about? Because a lot of times that can be somewhat of a confusing idea to wrap your head around. And it's not just you. A lot of people have had a lot of trouble wrapping their heads around what privacy means. And so what we've got here on the screen is what I would call the policy wonks definition, or if you were to do a search engine search for what is privacy, you might get some phrases like this that are relatively famous, at least among lawyers and people like that. And so things like the right to be left alone, that dates back to the US in the 1890s when the Kodak Brownie camera, that little brown square or cube camera that people would carry around, and everyone thought, oh, if you can have your picture taken on the street, this is the end of society. No one will be able to function like this if you could just randomly have your picture taken. And so it got people thinking about this modern idea of how data and how our image and all of these other details are being used. Subsequently, in the 20th century, there were several, it's an understatement to say egregious abuses of personal information. If you look at how the Nazi regime weaponized records in order to target specific individuals, and in some circumstances, there's a correlation between how good the records were in a particular area and how effective the Nazi efforts were. And then you turn immediately after that to the Cold War and the Iron Curtain and the Soviet regimes in Eastern Europe, and how they also weaponized data and surveillance in order to stifle dissent and to keep people from going against the state. And so because of these really egregious harms that we saw, in many ways, Europe has driven the conversation in the 20th century about the fact that privacy is an important thing that we should all make good efforts to respect. So some of these other phrases have come about, not being subject to arbitrary interference. That's from the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, or the fact that respect for private and family life is a fundamental human right. That's something that was established in the European Convention on Human Rights, extended to Bermuda since 1953. But also you have the general principles about protection against intrusion that are present in the common law, or respecting the autonomy of individuals that you might find if you were talking to your doctor. That's what they're thinking about when they think about privacy. So there's a lot of different ways to think about the concept of privacy. But that doesn't necessarily help when you're thinking, okay, what does that mean I have to do when I'm sitting at my desk at my office and I have some information in front of me and I need to put it in a filing cabinet, or I need to share it with someone? What does this mean that I have to do? And so I like to think about privacy in this way, that it's all about the management of information as it relates to an individual. And the reason why I love that definition is because we're tying everything back to an individual. We're tying things to a specific person. It's all about what's important for this person and what is going to be successful or in their interests, or a way that they will understand. We're thinking about that specific person. And that can prevent you from making some mistakes, like getting in too legalistic in what you're doing, because ultimately the goal is to communicate to a person, to understand what a person is thinking and help them control that information about themselves. As time went on in the 20th century, we moved away from concerns about government abuse of data, and people became more and more concerned about private sector use of data, because the private sector became more involved in our daily lives. I mean, if you just think about your cell phone and you're trying to send a message to someone, then potentially, if you were using an app, then the app could, the app maker could identify what your information was or what your message was. Possibly your phone manufacturer may be able to access those sorts of details, or possibly your wireless provider could know that, or could at least know the basics about who you are and who you communicated with, and that a communication existed, things like that. So we're getting more and more people involved in what used to be a simple, I just lean over and I whisper something to Brett. It's not that simple anymore. It's not a simple something that I can just control. And especially now, especially today, and we're seeing more and more that everything we do is creating data in some way. All of our communications, all of our choices and interactions are involving personal information, because there are very few circumstances where we're even having face-to-face conversations now. So it's an especially important issue in modern times. So what does this mean you have to do as an organization if you want to respect someone's privacy? We'll talk a lot more about what PIPA says and what it means and what you actually have to do. But if I was going to do like a telecommercial and say just 3 easy steps, here's what I would say would be the 3 easy steps for how to think about privacy. And first is, give a person information so that they can make an informed choice. And again, we're tying this back to the individual, and we're trying to say, okay, what do they need to know in order to make an informed choice about this particular use of this particular data? So you're giving them whatever's customized for that circumstance. Make sure and give them a clear way to tell you what their choice is. So there's no kind of implying or assuming or things like that. It's being clearly expressed. Here is what I, an individual, want to happen, and you have my permission to do that. And then once you've gone through that exchange, an organization has to keep the promises that you make. And that can sound really deceptively easy, because there are a lot of potential uses for data, or a lot of different requirements that you may have to interact with different people, or even things that might not have occurred to you when you first collected the data. But then as you started the process of helping the person or providing a service to a person, you realize maybe there's another option, or there's another way you could do it. But if it wasn't part of that original purpose that you explained to them, then you're not lining up. You're not keeping that promise that you made in that sense. But PIPA provides some options for how you can go through that, and we'll do that. We'll talk through those as we go through. But the main thing to keep in mind is give people information so that they can understand, make sure they can tell you what their choice is, and abide by any promises. Okay? So why does privacy matter? Why is this so important? We think, quite often about the kind of philosophical, or maybe I think about the philosophical aspect of this, about how privacy is empowering, how it can give people an opportunity to try new things or be creative. I mean, if you think about a lot of the scientific discoveries that came about, it was because somebody was doing something that was a little bit different, was a little bit unusual, or maybe even everybody else thought it was a bad idea. And yet they went ahead with it anyways, and it turned out to be a great discovery. And so having that flexibility of being able to, cordon yourself off and say, okay, I don't want to look like a fool, so I'm going to do this all by myself, and then maybe I'll share it with people if I succeed. That's so important for trying new things and living your life. But even more, privacy has some very pragmatic benefits. And so I want to talk about those, because I think they get underestimated, because they're so foundational to how some aspects of our society works. So in many ways, privacy enables democracy. So the very foundation of our democratic societies, because it gives people the ability to say, here are the people I want to associate with. Here are the messages that I want to communicate. Here are, when I vote, we have secret ballots, because we don't want people's vote to be subject to outside influence other than the typical political process. But in other words, it's kind of the underpinning or a lot of these other things that we take for granted. It comes the same way in commerce, because we have to have trust in order to complete a commercial transaction. There has to be some foundation of trust and understanding and belief that, okay, I'm going to hand you this piece of paper that we have agreed has value, and then you're going to give me an item, and you know, I can trust that you're going to walk into the back room and get it for me and not, you know, run away, or whatever the case may be. You know, there's some sort of foundational trust in every transaction. But when we're doing electronic transactions and online purchases or online services, that's particularly important, because you can't necessarily look someone in the eye and gauge them up. You know, you have to take that leap of faith through the screen, even if you're not seeing someone. And so knowing that we have this framework in place for how we're going to protect personal information makes it more likely that individuals are going to share your address or share your payment information, because you know that thanks to laws like PIPA, you can hold the other person accountable if they misuse it. Further, personal information is used in financial decisions, like think about your mortgage rates or your credit reports, things like that. A lot of major decisions that affect your life are based on personal information. And so it's really important that we give individuals a way to see what that information is, to understand how it's being used, to correct it if it's not right. We want to make sure the individual is represented in that process. And lastly, again, this gets a little bit philosophical perhaps, but more and more tangible. As we do more and more things online, we're surfing around and we're getting information, and people are observing our behavior and then trying to figure out who we are and how they can put us into boxes in order to sell us supplies, or in order to provide us links to other services or news articles or whatever the case may be. But they're making assumptions about us that, you know, if I went to a ski resort website and then I went to a shoes website, maybe the next thing they were going to show me would be an ad for snow boots or something like that. You know, they're putting those pieces together. But they're also making a lot of assumptions. And so they're important issues when it comes to helping an individual remain in control of what information they receive. And we're not only receiving this kind of echo chamber type of information, but also someone could put you in a box that is used to discriminate against you as well. And so it's really important that we have the ability to see that and to challenge that and give individuals those rights. So that's another reason why privacy and laws like PIPA are so important. The one question I get all the time is, what's the difference between security and privacy? And Brett will talk a little bit more about some cybersecurity tips and practices later on, but to give you kind of a high level concept of what we mean about the difference between security and privacy. I like to think about security as this picture on the left, the safe bank vault, and it's, you know, big and it's thick and it's heavy, and it'll take the cat burglar forever to drill through, and, you know, long enough for the police to arrive, and, you know, they've considered what the risks are, and they've built that appropriate secure controls around it in order to protect whatever it is. And so privacy, you have to have that. You have to have that security, but it's something a little bit different, because now we're thinking, okay, well, what are we putting inside the safe? What are these things that are potentially sensitive that could cause harm to an individual? Who should be able to get inside the safe? Who should be able to use them? You know, if I work for an organization, I may have the access code to get in a safe and access the data, but there may only be certain things that I'm allowed to do with it according to company policies. And if I chose to do something else with it, that could be a privacy violation, even if it wasn't a security violation. And so it's two slightly different, though I like to say they're a Venn diagram of overlapping things. But if you need a quick visual for how to think about privacy and security, security is how you protect the data. Privacy is about deciding what you do with the data and how it's being used and how you're communicating with the individual about how it's being used. So now I want to talk about the main point of our conversation, the Personal Information Protection Act. It's a new law, though it's not new to the world. We've seen laws like PIPA all around the world, most notably the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation in the European Union, and also the United Kingdom's Data Protection Act are two that were heavily influenced PIPA. And even we're seeing them in North America too. Of course, Canada's had privacy laws for decades. We're seeing them more and more in the US. Just last year, California had a privacy law come into effect, and more states are proposing them. So PIPA is very much in line with what you're seeing as part of an international consensus on best practices and ways to handle personal information. So what does PIPA say? Let's talk through that. The first thing you should know about when you think about PIPA are the minimum requirements. And these will apply to every organization, no matter what you're doing. Even an organization that might have some other exemptions, like national security or some other regulatory function, something like that, there's still the obligation to meet the minimum requirements. So it's really important to think of this as the baseline. These are also relatively high level and relatively principles based. And so that means that there's more detail that needs to be fleshed out, which is what you'll see coming from my office. But also you should think about them more as a guide for how to conduct your business and not necessarily an instruction list for exactly what you're supposed to do. So the first minimum requirement is the principle of responsibility and compliance. And essentially what that says is if an organization collects personal information, they are responsible for what happens to that personal information and for meeting their obligations under PIPA. And even if you engage a third party to process the data or to manage your IT systems or what have you, you are still responsible. And so you need to implement the privacy program. You need to appoint a privacy officer, all of that good stuff. It's ultimately down to the organization. The principle of fairness is, again, these are very short. It's only one sentence, but it says personal information should be used fairly and lawfully. And so lawfully, of course, that should be the obvious one. But when you think about fairly, I like to think about it in terms of using the information in a way that is in the individual's best interest or not contrary to their interests, certainly. But again, these are things that will be fleshed out more and we'll have more guidance on as we go forward. Proportionality is the idea that you only collect the data that you need in order to accomplish a specific purpose. So there's a couple of things to walk through there. And the first is, well, that means we have to establish a purpose. So what is the purpose for why an organization is collecting data? And, because you have to communicate that to the individual, but it also informs these sorts of dynamics as well. And then, so once you've established what your purpose is, you can say, well, what data do we need to accomplish that purpose? And I like to think about it in terms of the minimum necessary. So what is the minimum necessary amount of data that we need to accomplish the purpose? You may not need the person's entire biography or, all of their, details going all the way back to when they got sent to the principal's office in school. Or, you might not need all of that information. You might just need a name and a driver's license number or a birth date or, it can depend on the service that you're offering or the specific purpose that you're trying to accomplish. And so these principles will always be somewhat relative because they've got to respond to the specific situation that you are in. The next principle is integrity, and this means keeping the data accurate, complete, and up to date for the purpose that you're trying to accomplish. And again, going back to thinking about the minimum necessary data, Sometimes you might not need all the specifics, but when something more broad would suffice. So for example, if you need to verify someone's age, you might not need day, month, and year. You might only need year. And that's enough because you validated that they are old enough, or over 21, or whatever the case may be. So you can think about ways to minimize your data again in that way. But another way to think about data integrity is that sometimes data needs to be updated. So things like birthdays are never going to change. Your birth date is a single fact. But however, unfortunately, I know for myself, I'll speak, something like perhaps your weight could change quite a bit, especially when you're in lockdown and you're eating nothing but bread and cheese all the time, or whatever the case may be. So that may be something that you have to check back in every month or every 6 months or something like that, if it's important to accomplish your purpose. So again, it's going to be relative to what purpose you're trying to accomplish. Our last minimum requirement is the security principle. And this means that organizations should evaluate what the risk of harm is from potential misuse of data, and then put appropriate controls in place. So again, thinking back to the bank vault, the risk there was that someone might try to steal the money or break in after hours. And so, they made the walls very thick. They only gave the bank manager the password to get in, things like that. It's going to vary based on your particular circumstances. Sometimes the risk of harm is very low if it's what I call directory information. So things like someone's name and address. It's still personal information, but there's not necessarily a harm that could come to that. But if it was someone's name and then at the top it said, bankruptcy risk and they were on a list of potential bankruptcy risks, then all of a sudden you're making assumptions about individuals. You're using personal information in a particular way. And if that was inadvertently released to the public, or if that was misused, then there could be a harm that comes to the person. There could be embarrassment. There could be a loss of business. There's a lot of things that could happen to an individual. But the point being that the security controls will vary based on exactly what's needed in those particulars. So turning from the minimum requirements, I call these the additional requirements. It's just kind of a few other requirements that come into PIPA. And the first is purpose limitation. So we identified what purpose we're trying to accomplish earlier because we had to figure out what data was the minimum amount of data. Well, PIPA also says you can only use the data for that purpose you identified. That's all you can do with it. And then it says unless. And so unless you go and you get an additional consent of the individual to use it for another purpose, or if it fits a specific circumstance, like you have to lawfully use it, you have to provide it by law or something like that. So there are circumstances where you may need to use it for other purposes, but generally speaking, you should only use data for the purpose it was collected. Conditions for using personal information. I like to say PIPA is not a tick the box exercise. It's very much a guiding exercise and helping you think about how your organization does business. But in terms of conditions, it is a bit of a tick the box exercise because Section 6 of PIPA has a list of conditions and you have to meet one of them. And so it could be that your condition for lawfully using the data is that you have the consent of the individual. It could be that it's because you needed that information to fulfill a contract. It could be because there's a law that says you have to collect the data. Whatever the case may be, you want to make sure you're outlining what your condition for using the data is. And a lot of people will default to consent as the condition for using data. It's just the way we think about things. It's particularly in a North American context. We think, okay, well, I'll just ask the person, get the person to give me permission, and we're done with it. From a PIPA perspective, you should keep in mind that there are some specific characteristics that consent has to meet. But also, if consent is given, then consent can be withdrawn. And if it's a freely given consent, then they can take it back. And if that's the case, and if they do take it back, then that means you no longer have a lawful basis for using that data. And the data may need to be deleted, or the data may, there could be a complaint against you for retaining the data, things like that. So keep in mind that, if consent is given, consent can be taken as well, and that has some other implications. So privacy notice, PIPA talks about some specific things that have to be in a privacy notice. A lot of people think about website privacy notices when they're thinking about these, but it could come in a variety of forms. It could be a handout when they come into the reception room of your building. It could be a sign posted on the wall. It could be a paragraph next to the part where they sign their name. There's a lot of different ways to think about notice, and it could be a combination of all of these things. But there must be certain elements included that are described in PIPA. Sensitive personal information is a defined term. There are specific types of information that could be race or ethnic origin, sexuality, religion, political affiliation, different things like that are considered sensitive and they're specifically called out. And that essentially has two implications. First, think back to security and when you're assessing the risk of harm. If something is sensitive personal information, there is a higher risk of harm that something could be, that data could be used against an individual, whether that's for discrimination or some other purpose. But you have to make sure you're anticipating that higher risk of harm with it being sensitive data. And then look back to the conditions for using personal information as well, because there are some restrictions on the types of conditions that you may choose if you're using sensitive information. So those are the main things to keep in mind when you think about sensitive personal information. Lastly, personal information about children. Now, PIPA specifically says if you are offering what's called an internet society service, which is an online service of some kind to children, then if they are under the age of 14, then you have to get parental consent in a specific way, and there are certain things that you're not able to ask. The idea behind this is that if a child is playing an app on an iPad or some other tablet device, and suddenly they get a pop-up that says, by the way, what did your mommy and daddy do for a job? Pick one of the following. A lot of times kids would just provide that information. They wouldn't even think about it. And so there had to be some caps on those sorts of practices. Now, this is not saying that the age of consent is 14 years of age, because we're only really talking about internet society services in this specific context. So generally speaking, when we're talking about a person giving consent for the use of their personal information, or a parent acting on behalf of a child, all the normal legal rules apply for those sorts of things. So the third section for PIPA I want to talk about is in many ways the most important section, because instead of PIPA creating one regulator, meaning the privacy commissioner, what it really did is it empowered 60,000 regulators. It gave everyone in Bermuda the ability to go directly to an organization and say, I want to understand more about the information you have about me and how you're using it. And I want you to give me a copy. I want to have access to that information. Or it uses the term rectification, which is a fancy way of saying correction. So if a birth date was incorrect, or if some sort of other factor or detail about their financial history, for example, was incorrect, they could have it corrected. Individuals can block the use of data for marketing purposes, which is especially powerful, as we talked about with advertising and other profiles that are being built about individuals. And lastly, there are certain circumstances where an individual can request data be erased or destroyed. And what this means is that if there's, for example, no longer a lawful condition for having the information, then an individual could request it be erased. Or if the purpose has been completed, and so the organization no longer has a need for that information because the purpose is completed. In that case, then they could also request erasure. So there's certain circumstances. It's not, an overall. You've got to forget about, you tell your cousin you got to forget about, what you guys got up to one summer when you were kids, or whatever. It's more about dealing with information in particular contexts and in particular circumstances. And I'd be happy to get more into any of these details if you'd like to reach out to my office. It'd be my pleasure to talk more. But before I stop, I want to talk a little bit about how to put all of these in place. What does a privacy program look like in order to fulfill these different requirements for PIPA? And this is just a taster. So this is just a very high level to give you a general idea of what a privacy program looks like. So generally speaking, it's going to involve these steps. And I'll talk through these very briefly, but I want to be sure and point out the website address at the bottom. We have a blog post that goes into a lot of detail about each of these and what they actually mean and how to do them. And so that'd be a great place to start if you want to learn more about them. But so just walking through them very quickly, we start with conducting an inventory. And that means understanding what data you have. Do you have data stored in a filing cabinet? Do you have things stored on a computer? Where is your information? And what is it? What type of data? Is it names, addresses, credit card numbers, whatever the case may be? Understanding what those elements are and how they move through your organization. So someone walks in the front door and fills out a form and hands it to the reception desk. And then they take it and they scan it and they put it in a filing cabinet, or whatever the case may be. Understanding how that works, because that helps you identify where particular changes may need to occur and how you do things. So again, document all of those practices for how you're using data, who has access to data, what are the different roles and responsibilities. I use the phrase document here. I realize for some organizations it may mean create documentation, but in some circumstances, maybe it's just update your existing documentation. But in any case, make sure you've got that very clear so individuals know what their personal roles and responsibilities are, and also you can hold employees accountable for following. So provide training and awareness to staff or others, teach them what they're supposed to do. Make sure they're constantly thinking about what privacy risks are. And that's a great way for an organization to identify these risks, because a lot of times an employee will have a better idea of what comes across their desk than a privacy officer who's just walking around and chatting with people. And so having that kind of distributed network of people thinking about these issues is so critical. So analyze privacy risk. We talked about everything comes down to risk of harm. What's the harm that could happen? And how could the data be used inappropriately? So there are tools like privacy impact assessments that will help you walk through a business process and make sure you're meeting all the different steps that you need to meet as part of that business process. And it helps you to build an action plan for what steps need to occur next. Develop a plan for how you're going to respond to incidents or breaches of security. So when something happens, and something will happen at some point, whether that's an email gets sent to the wrong person, or someone leaves their bag on the bus, or whatever the case may be, something will happen. How will you respond? What does an employee do? Who do they notify? What do those folks do? Who is the final decision maker? Are you going to form a committee? Who would those members be? You can pre-draft letters. One of the things that PIPA says when it comes in effect will be to notify the Privacy Commissioner's Office when there's been a breach of security. So there's no reason why we can't go ahead and start having dialogue in advance and help you craft a letter that has the appropriate information. So I'm happy to support you throughout that process. But be thinking about it now, because once you have an incident, it can be a very hectic time. And also, in case you needed to get a lawyer or a consultancy or someone like that, you're not in a very good negotiating position if you're in the middle of a data breach. They can charge you whatever they want because you need the service right then. So go ahead and make those kinds of agreements in advance. And lastly, developing procedures to respond to PIPA rights requests. Again, thinking back to the individual rights we just talked about for access, rectification, blocking, or erasure. If someone were to call your call center or call your front desk and say, I want to exercise my right to access the data you have about me, would that person know what to do? Would they know who to take a message and who to give it to? Things like that. And understanding what you need to do and how you're going to respond when you're in this. So again, we get into a lot more detail on this on our guidance note, what is a privacy program? The website in general is privacy.bm. We have a blog where you can keep up to date with all of our events. We're trying to do lots of webinars, especially as we're all working remotely more and more now. But we also have some guidance notes that have been posted and just updated our legislation and guidance page with some frequently asked questions. And so hopefully that'll be of great use to you. And please know you can reach out anytime. We have a contact us page on the website, and we're more than happy to answer even quick questions. If you just wanted to ask about a specific thing, we're more than happy to talk about those sorts of things. I think that's one of the great things about Bermuda is that, I'm not some mysterious figure off, in a castle. I have to walk the streets just like everybody else. And so I want to make sure that you feel comfortable coming to me and asking. So with that said, I'm going to stop sharing and turn this over to Brett, who has some cybersecurity tips.
Thanks, Alex. Let me know when you can see my screen.
Yes, coming through.
Does it say privacy and cyber, the basics?
Yes, it does.
Great. So as Alex mentioned, there is a difference between security and privacy, but there is a massive overlap. And, I appreciate some of your data you can protect might not be digital, but the majority is. And I sort of have a similar view to Alex with the safe. I sort of think about it as a wall, and how high we have to set that wall depends on what we're trying to protect. And so you need to risk assess yourselves. Obviously, the level of security you need would be different from a bank, for instance. But I also think there's some minimums. And today we're just going to touch, kind of briefly on what I think some of those minimum requirements are. A lot of them at zero cost to you. But if there are various items you want a deeper dive on IT, then again, reach out to Leah or Kelly, and we'll do a future session. So passwords, hugely important, and a lot more important than people think. And there's just some tips here I just wanted to briefly go through about trying to make those more secure. So use a long passphrase. It's 100% certain that the length and complexity of your password is far more important than how frequently you change it. But that gets tricky. So something I've done, and that's why this is the first point, it's made my life a whole lot easier, is I've moved to pass phrases, whether it's 3 words joined together or similar like that. I'm finding it really easy to understand, and I'm getting to 14 or 16 characters pretty quickly. And the length of the password makes a large difference to anybody that's trying to crack that or to guess that. Don't make them easy to guess. I think here, pets' names, children's names, pretty much all those things I could find out on the attendees by going to Facebook. They are not a good idea. There's a lot of social engineering involved by the bad guys, which means trolling all that thing, the internet, to find out things they know about you. And you'd be surprised. Facebook, I think, is a great example of the sort of stuff we put on there that really doesn't need to be there. But like Alex was talking about, collect what you need, but also I think probably share what you need on some of those open platforms as well. Avoid using common words in your passwords. That's not at odds with using a long passphrase. What that means is substitute some of those things within those words. So an at's a great use for an A, 3 for an E. Again, if you just mix up those words a little bit and get to that passphrase, you're going to get to a fairly strong password, and one that you can remember without writing down on a bit of paper on your desk, because that's kind of defeating the purpose, and we're definitely looking to avoid that. Keep your passwords on the down low. Please don't share passwords. They should all be unique. I know on occasions, there's a reason why we do that, but every time you do it, it chips away a little bit of that security. And the more you do it, the more it's chipping away, and the less secure that password is. Unique account, unique password, even more important in 2021. The number of passwords we need a few at work, but we've got Netflix, we've got Amazon and Shein. I've got girls, so well aware of those websites. But the bank, literally, we're using these passwords all the time. The last thing you want to do is have a common password, because once that password is then breached, then you're vulnerable for all those things. And the bad guys are pretty clever these days, and they will do that. So if they have managed to get hold of your password in some way, they will try it on other services. And they also share information. There's a lot of websites out there. There's been some big breaches in the last few years. Yahoo, Disney Plus was breached not long after it launched last year. And so they have a lot of email accounts and passwords associated with that. And they share that on the internet. And so people can just go and get that. And I know what you use for Disney Plus. Well, I can try that for Netflix, for various other services. So I know it makes it a bit more complicated, but you're really doing yourself a disservice and making yourself vulnerable if you're using a common password across all domains. Think about multi-factor. I know it sounds a bit technical, but it's got a lot simpler these days, and it makes a massive difference. So the most common thing we see around multi-factor is our password. So that's something we know, but also something we have, a token, which generates a code, etc. So if the bad guy happens to get hold of what we know, the password, because we've inadvertently shared that, or there's been some sort of phishing attack where I've put those details into a fake website, that second factor really does save us, and it does increase security by a whole lot. Think about using a password manager to remember long passwords. I mentioned just how many we have to use these days, and that's the reality, and it gets really tricky. And I really encourage you to use unique ones, but if we're getting to a volume where it's difficult, then there are a lot of cheap and in some cases free tools out there I would encourage you to explore that would make you a whole lot safer. Well, this talks about ransomware, but I think some of these are just the buckets, the basics. I mentioned ransomware in the heading here because we've seen a massive uptick under COVID. And it's been a bit of a double whammy, unfortunately. So we've seen COVID used as a theme to deploy a lot of ransomware and phishing attacks, but also at the same time that we've been working from home. There was a time when your home and work environments were separate places, but for a while that merged, and all that security that your organization was giving to you, we kind of lost when we got home a little bit. So ransomware has been a real problem over the last 12 months. And there are, again, some basics you can do, not just to protect yourself from ransomware, but any kind of malicious cyber activity. So back up your data. It's just fundamental, and people just don't think about it enough. And a bit like Alex was talking about, the data that you need to collect. It's like that for backups as well. Think about what you need to back up, and that'll tell you how frequently you need to back it up as well. Some of that static data you might need, weekly might be okay, or monthly. Data that's changing frequently, you should be backing up a lot more frequently. Keep it separate from your computer. Now, whether that means offline, back in the day we had tapes and things like that, or even just plugging in an external drive and keeping it offline and somewhere else, it's hugely important. By far the cheapest and easiest way to recover from an incident, or if someone's holding you to ransom through encrypting your data, is simply to rebuild your environment. the longer you've been between backups, the more complicated that gets, and the bigger that gap is, and the more damage it does for you. Consider the cloud. It's hard not to these days. It's a lot more cost effective than it used to be, and I think that's separate from your environment. I would consider the cloud as well. Update and patch systems. The reality with IT is that any product that's released has been tested, but it's not perfect, and that includes Microsoft and all their Windows releases, etc. Once those things are out there into the world, then the good and bad guys are hammering away identifying vulnerabilities. They always find them, and then the sort of vendors then are advised of those. Certainly, if the good guys find them, then they release patches to close those. So if you're not up to date with your patching, again, which is free, just takes a bit of time, then there's likely you have vulnerabilities, whether it's applications or, as I mentioned, Windows, your operating environment, that don't need to exist. Alex did talk about reviewing and exercising incident response plan if you had a privacy breach. Exactly the same for security, IT security, and cyber is just a new word for IT security. Think about what you would do if you had an incident. If the first time you think about it is when it's happened, then, as Alex said, I think you're setting yourself up to fail. Now, I appreciate a lot of you are not-for-profits and don't have that the resources to have a detailed plan, but think about the basics here. What am I going to do? Who am I going to call? What are my responsibilities? And at least have thought through that as a minimum. And then education, again, showing you the commonality between security and privacy, something that Alex mentioned as well. And by educate, I think there's a lot of things we can do around ransomware, talking to our staff about emails and what to click, not to click. And there's a lot of free resources out there. You don't need to come to firms like Deloitte, although we're happy to help, obviously. But especially in the UK and US, there are a lot of government websites that provide a bunch of great free information that you could leverage at no cost to make yourself and your team a bit more aware. And just as an example of that, I've been looking at the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency site in the US, CISA.gov, super easy to find. But and just finishing on a couple of their points and images I've lifted from them. Please back up. Make sure you're up to date with patching, and especially with emails. If it looks suspicious, just hit that delete button. If it is important, they'll resend it. If it's not, I think you've saved yourself an awful lot of grief. So with that, I know it was fairly fast. If anybody wants a deeper dive on IT security, we're happy to do another session. But in the interest of Q&A and stopping recording, this is where we're going to finish for today.